for inviting me, Jan. Okay. So yeah, I'll jump in. So a little bit about me, bit of background. I'm a professor of psychology at Durham University in the UK, and my research focuses on social psychology. However, I find myself these days more and more publishing articles on issues connected to the replication crisis and metascience. Um, and I think I can sort of sum up my general point is that I'd like to call for more nuance in the claims that we make in this area. So, for example, I've highlighted philosophies of science in which pre-registration is less useful and low replication rates may not represent a crisis. And I've highlighted situations in which exploratory tests can be more compelling than confirmatory tests, and which HARKing is not so problematic. And finally, I provided some nuance to the consideration of statistical type 1 error rates and cautioned against what I call inconsistent multiple testing corrections. So in that same spirit, what I wanted to do today is question some common metascience assumptions. And some of them can be summed up in this famous figure from Manafo et al.'s Manifesto for Reproducible Science, which has over 3,000 citations. So here it's argued that researcher bias, low power, HARKing, p-hacking, and publication bias lead to false positives and low replication rates. And to be fair, there's good evidence and arguments that exploratory results are more tentative than confirmatory results, that questionable research practices such as HARKing and p-hacking are problematic, and that publication bias and low replication rates do need to be addressed. However, what seems to be less appreciated is that there's also plenty of good evidence and arguments that question each of these assumptions and that, at the very least, calls for some nuance in their formulation. Now, of course, none of this work is beyond criticism. Nonetheless, it should be part of the conversation, and I do worry that it's being sidelined to some extent, perhaps because people feel that it weakens the narrative of a science-wide crisis, and that discussing it might slow down the widespread adoption of science reforms. So what I aim to do today is to run through as many of these 10 common meta-science assumptions as I can in the time I have available. I probably won't get to the end of this list, but let's see how we do. And yeah, to try to highlight some alternative perspectives. Now, straight away, you'll notice that I'm using the word bad here, which is obviously a gross oversimplification. But I think it does capture the kind of moralizing aspect of the meta-science narrative, that the replication crisis is caused by researchers' bad or questionable research practices, and that if we can stop researchers from engaging in these practices, then we'll go some way towards solving the crisis. So the first issue I want to address is whether there actually is a science-wide replication crisis. In fact, if we class a successful replication as finding a significant result in the same direction as the original study, then the typical replication rate is around 63%. And that's based on Kobe et al.'s review of 116 replication studies, Nozick et al.'s review of 307 replication studies, and Tyne et al.'s recent test of 274 claims. Now, we don't know what the optimal replication rate should be. All we can do is survey people and ask them what they expect the replication rate to be. And it turns out that people expect around 63% of claims to replicate. And that's based on 6 studies that use prediction markets and forecasting surveys to estimate expected replication rates. So based on expected replication rates, there's actually no grounds for declaring a replication crisis. You'll see nestled in there on the third dot point is some recent work by Vallis et al., which is a preprint that came out a couple of days ago. They have a different perspective to me, although I'd still argue that about a 7% difference between observed and expected replication rates, is that grounds for a crisis? It's debatable. It's also important to note that there's variability in observed replication rates, but this variability undermines claims of a science-wide replication crisis. Perhaps replication rates are much lower than expected in some areas, but not in others. And finally, if we believe in scientific progress and the growth of knowledge, then we should acknowledge that we actually need replication failures to motivate the discovery of new moderating variables and boundary conditions. If all studies replicated perfectly, then we'd be out of business, because it would imply that we knew everything and there was nothing left to discover. We'd have to shut up scientific shop and move on to something else. Okay, so moving on to this second claim, which is that exploratory research is more tentative. So it's been argued that because of this claim, falsely portraying exploratory research as confirmatory research can give a false sense of confidence about the research. And pre-registration is supposed to help here by clearly distinguishing between confirmatory and exploratory research. But to be honest, I'm not sure that it does. So let's have a closer look at that distinction. So it's a text-packed table here, but we'll start from the top and work our way through it. So at the beginning here, some people use the terms confirmatory and exploratory to refer to hypothesis testing and descriptive research, respectively. The problem with this distinction is that it implies that statistical tests of unplanned hypotheses are confirmatory, even when the hypotheses are generated after looking at the data. So I think most people these days would disagree with that kind of older definition. Moving on, some people would say that confirmatory analyses are independent from the current results, and exploratory analyses are based on the current results. But what happens if we pre-register an analysis that's designed to change depending on the results that we get in our analyses, perhaps using decision trees? So, for example, we might pre-register that we'll drop items from a scale if they significantly reduce the scale's reliability. Isn't this pre-registered approach exploratory? Because the scale items that we use in our analyses will depend on the results of our reliability analysis. And moving on, some people say that confirmatory and exploratory analyses refer to strong and weak theory, respectively. But then what happens if you pre-register a study which has got weak theory in it? Does that mean that you've pre-registered exploratory research effectively? So what about the idea then that confirmatory and exploratory analyses refer to planned and unplanned analyses, respectively? The problem here is that planning to undertake an exploratory analysis doesn't make it confirmatory. Indeed, some people argue that you can pre-register exploratory research. So planning per se doesn't seem to be the crucial issue here. So maybe confirmatory and exploratory analyses refer to predictions and postdictions. The problem I have here is that predictions can come from anywhere. For example, if I toss a coin to predict whether men or women will have higher self-esteem, then I've made a prediction. But it's not a prediction linked to any theory. So confirming that prediction will have no scientific value. So I think we have to question whether the timing of a prediction is really the key thing here, or whether the source of the prediction is more important. And moving on, some people link confirmatory and exploratory research to hypothesis testing and hypothesis generation, respectively. But what happens if you view your results and then search the literature for a hypothesis that's been confirmed by those results? Is that hypothesis generation, or hypothesis testing. I think it's debatable because the hypothesis was generated in the literature before the result was known, but it's used by you to explain the result after the result was known. And finally, some people argue that confirmatory research is research in which the type 1 error rate is controlled. But if your pre-registered approach is a plan, not a prison, then it will allow an unknown number of deviations in its repetitions, and therefore it won't control your type 1 error rate. So pre-registered studies that allow deviations should also be described as exploratory in my view. So in summary, the distinction between confirmatory and exploratory is a bit blurry, and pre-registration doesn't really help to make that distinction any clearer because you can easily plan and pre-register exploratory, result-dependent hypothesis tests based on weak theory and uncontrolled error rates. Okay, so just to return to the penultimate one there, I think the hypothesis testing and hypothesis generation, it's an interesting distinction because it relates to the issue of HARKing, or hypothesizing after the results are known. So let's consider some of the ways in which HARKing is bad. So Nozick and colleagues pointed out, HARKing is potentially problematic because post hoc theorizing sometimes leads to circular reasoning, in which the same result is used twice, once as part of a theoretical rationale for the hypothesis, and then a second time to provide support for that hypothesis. In other words, the same result is used to both generate and test the same hypothesis, which is bad. And I totally agree that this double use of the same result is problematic. However, undisclosed HARKing does not prevent you from identifying that circular reasoning. You don't need to know the true timing of a researcher's reasoning to know whether that reasoning is circular. Circularity is a question of logic, not history. And so you just need to look at the contents of the reasoning to identify any circularity. As Popper explained, the logical properties of statements are timeless. If a statement is a tautology, then it is a tautology once and for all. So let me give you an example. So imagine that a researcher tells you that they hypothesize that eating apples improves mood, but unbeknownst to you, they secretly harked this hypothesis after observing that eating apples improved the mood of the participants in their study. Now imagine that the researcher provides the following theoretical rationale for their secretly harked hypothesis. A, vitamin C improves mood, and B, apples are rich in vitamin C. Therefore, C, eating apples should improve mood. This theoretical rationale meets Popper's methodological rule to always try to deduce statements from others of higher universality. Importantly, we can clearly see that the current result, eating apples improves mood, has not been used in either of the two premises that are used to deduce the hypothesis. Consequently, we can confirm that there's no circular reasoning in using the results to support the hypothesis. Now, one interesting response to this is to question the definition of the word used here. You could, I think, legitimately argue that the researcher did use the results as an inspiration and motivation to generate their hypothesis. But is that problematic? Well, no, I don't think it is from my perspective. It's perfectly fine for a researcher to use a result to inspire the deduction of a hypothesis. According to Popper's deductive method of testing, all we need to do to avoid circular reasoning is to make sure that the current result is not used as a premise in the formal theoretical rationale, and a researcher's personal inspiration and motivation are not used in this way. So they don't compromise what John Worrell calls the epistemic independence between the rationale and the test results. The other thing to note here is that the motivated and biased reasoning don't necessarily imply illogical or unsound reasoning. And you don't need to know the timing of the reasoning to identify illogical or unsound reasoning. You just, again, need to look at the contents of the arguments. So, for example, if I predict that apples improve mood because bananas are yellow, then you don't need to check my pre-registration to appreciate that my reasoning is valid. It just doesn't make sense. You might also argue that there can be many different ways of testing the same hypothesis, and pre-registration is a useful way of limiting researchers' degrees of freedom by tying researchers down to a specific test. However, if there are lots of equally reasonable ways to test a hypothesis in a study, then pre-registering one of those ways doesn't invalidate the others. So pre-registration doesn't solve the problem of theoretical underspecification. Instead, we should take account of a theory's vagueness when we draw conclusions about a hypothesis in a process of inference to the best explanation. And we should use robustness analysis to explore sensible alternative predictions within studies. Another concern is that researchers who HARK will only ever confirm hypotheses and never falsify them. But as Norbert Kerr noted, this isn't true. Researchers can HARK disconfirmed hypotheses just as much as they can HARK confirmed hypotheses. So here's my version of the famous Texas sharpshooter analogy. And yes, the sharpshooter has HARKed and painted targets around his bullet hole in the top right of the fence here, but he's also currently drawing a target where there's no bullet hole. In other words, he's HARKing a disconfirmed hypothesis because he's drawing a target that he's missed. So, as Kerr explained, researchers can HARK hypothesis known post hoc to be contradicted by the data, and they may be motivated to do this to try to make their work more theoretically interesting. So it's not true that HARKing or exploratory research always leads to confirmations. It can also lead to disconfirmations. What about the ethics of HARKing? Well, HARKing is often acknowledged to fall into an ethical grey area, and even Kerr conceded that HARKing is not necessarily unethical. As he explained, HARKing can entail concealment, and the question then becomes whether what is concealed in HARKing can be a useful part of the truth or is instead basically uninformative and may therefore be safely ignored at the author's discretion. And I think to answer that question, we need to consider whether predictions are generated by people or by theories. So this slide by Denny Borsboon exemplifies the view that predictions are generated by people rather than theories, at least in psychology. So he says, in advanced fields, it's not so important what the theorist thinks. What matters is what the theory says. In psychology, however, not the theory, but the theorist holds phenomenon together. Thus, the theorist, rather than the theory, is making predictions. This is why pre-registration is important. Now, certainly, if you think this way, then you should also believe that the time at which the theorist generates the prediction is a useful part of the truth. And hiding this information by HARKing is unethical. However, is this really science, or is this just testing people's personal predictions, a bit like we do at the racetrack? So personally, I'd side more with Mark Schaller here, that any truly rigorous approach to psychological science requires that scientific hypotheses cannot be equated to personal predictions, and that hypotheses must instead be articulated as depersonalized products of some systematic analysis and appraised accordingly. And so if, like me and Schaller, you think that we're testing theoretical deductions rather than personal predictions, then the time at which a prediction is deduced from a theory doesn't form a useful part of the truth, because the consequence of a logical deduction doesn't change over time. It's timeless, as Popper would say. For example, the soundness and validity of the deduction that vitamin C improves mood and apples are rich in vitamin C, therefore eating apples will improve mood, doesn't change depending on whether it's made before or after we obtain evidence for that hypothesis. So getting back to ethics, if you think that predictions are deduced from theories rather than from people, then it's not deceptive to say, as predicted by theory X, even when that prediction is secretly deduced after a relevant result has become known, because the prediction refers to a timeless theoretical deduction rather than a specific person's atheoretical guess about the future. So you can legitimately and ethically say, as predicted by the theory of gravity, even after you see an apple fall from a tree, because it's not you that's making the prediction, it's the theory of gravity. So my point is that the temporal information that's concealed by HARKing is only important if you're testing people's personal predictions. It's not important if you're testing theoretically deduced predictions. And in my view, the way in which psychology becomes an advanced science, to quote Borsboom, is to depend on its theories more and not less. We're doing okay for time. So another common concern about HARKing is that it may lead to overfitting. Overfitting occurs when researchers construct a hypothesis on the basis of results from a specific sample, but they accidentally accommodate the idiosyncratic and unrepresentative properties of that sample in their HARKed hypothesis. So the hypothesis provides a better fit to that particular sample than it does to the population it's supposed to represent. And confirmatory hypothesis testing is supposed to avoid overfitting by preventing researchers from changing their hypothesis in response to their results. But it may also lead to underfitting. In particular, it may prevent researchers from confirming an unplanned hypothesis that produced a better fit with the population. So Protzko gave a nice example of this, in which a researcher fits a pre-registered linear model to a curvilinear association and confirms a significant result. However, in this case, the confirmatory linear model is actually underfitting the actual pattern of data, and an unplanned curvilinear model would have avoided this. Okay, so I talked a lot about HARKing. Let's move on to researcher bias. So some people believe that pre-registration and registered reports reduce researcher bias. For example, Vizier et al. Explained that the aim of the registered report format is to reduce bias by eliminating many of the avenues for undisclosed flexibility in research. And Chris Chambers colorfully described registered reports as a vaccine against research bias. And I think the problem with that perspective is that research bias influences not only the post hoc selection of hypotheses, data, analyses, and results, in other words, selective reporting, but also the a priori selection of hypotheses, methods, analyses, and interpretations, what I would call selective questioning. And ironically, it's biased, I think, to focus on selective reporting without also considering selective questioning. So, for example, pre-registering the number of times that a researcher will toss a coin may help to identify and reduce the selective reporting of their results. For example, only reporting when their coin lands heads and not when it lands tails. However, the reduction of that selective reporting will not reduce researcher bias if the researcher's pre-registered decision rule is heads I win, tails you lose. So, as Clark et al. Put it, the dice have often been loaded before pre-registration, and we need to adopt a more holistic view of researcher bias to see that. And when we adopt this more holistic perspective, we can see that a pre-registered study can actually be more biased than a non-pre-registered study because its selective questioning may be more problematic than its selective reporting. More generally, I think the concept of bias reduction assumes that researchers can get closer to an unbiased evaluation, which smacks of naive objectivism and value-free science. What you think is unbiased, I may think is biased. So I think a more tenable position is that open science practices help to reveal different perspectives rather than to reduce biases. For example, robustness or multiverse analyses allow readers to understand how different analytical approaches produce different results. And in that sense, they allow us to reveal different perspectives rather than to reduce biases. So I know this is a bit simplistic, but the social psychologist in me likes this quote by Hull. It gets across Popper's point that science is a social enterprise, and as such, individuals' different biases and perspectives are inevitable and necessary to understand the reality that none of us can access directly. Let me try and fit in a couple of examples about research.
I think we lost Mark there. Let's see if we can get him back.
Oh, there you go. Away we go again. So, yeah, as I was saying, the hindsight bias doesn't prevent researchers from, or readers, from actually changing their mind about a hypothesis. It only obscures this attitude change from their conscious awareness. So researchers may still unconsciously update their belief about a hypothesis, even if they fool themselves into believing that they knew it all along. So in my view, the hindsight bias actually helps science because it prevents researchers' need for self-consistency from obstructing scientific progress. Okay, moving on, the confirmation bias is a tendency for researchers to interpret evidence as confirming their hypotheses. Importantly, however, this bias is stronger when hypotheses are viewed as being more plausible. So again, this bias actually facilitates scientific progress by preventing well-established, highly plausible theories from being disconfirmed too easily. For example, it's functional for scientists to have a confirmation bias towards the theory of evolution relative to creationist accounts. Have I got 5 minutes to talk about multiple testing, or should we have a stop?
You have 5 more minutes.
Thanks. I will then talk about this for a second. So this is a controversial one. So another common concern is that tests of many different individual hypotheses inflate the type 1 error rates. And in my view, they don't. So if you undertake a single test of a single null hypothesis, then you only have one opportunity to make a type 1 error in relation to that hypothesis. Critically, your type 1 error rate for that statistical inference is not inflated if you conduct 1,000,000 or more than 1,000,000 such tests side by side in the same study. Now, I will qualify that and say that there are some approaches, the error statistical approach, for example, that do disagree with that point of view. But there are other perspectives that don't disagree, and I've listed 20 references there, which you're free to look up. If you go to my website, I've actually got the quotes from each of those, which explain why I think each of those people kind of support that view that I've just described. But let me try and give an example to explain why I think that. So yeah, this principle applies even if you selectively report the results of one of your significant tests because it yielded a significant result. In other words, p-hacking. So to give an example, consider Randall Munro's famous jelly bean cartoon. So you can see in the black square at the top there that researchers were originally asked to test the hypothesis that jelly beans cause acne. And they find no evidence for that hypothesis. And so they proceed to test 20 different colors of jelly bean. And finally, after finding a single significant result, they conclude that jelly beans are linked to acne. Green jelly beans are linked to acne. In this case, the hypothesis in the black square can be interpreted as a joint hypothesis that jelly beans of one or more colors cause acne. And I totally agree that an alpha adjustment would be needed if we wanted to make this sort of claim based on at least one significant result from among the 20 tests that were subsequently conducted. However, the researchers don't end up making a claim about a joint hypothesis. Instead, as you can see in the green square, they claim that green jelly beans are linked to acne. And this claim is supported by a single test of a single hypothesis, not multiple tests. So consequently, and contrary to the way this cartoon is usually construed, this claim does not require an alpha adjustment. In short, it's not the number of significant tests that you perform that matters. It's the number of tests that are formally associated with your statistical inference that matter. And in this case, only one test is used to infer that green jelly beans cause acne. So no alpha adjustment is needed. Okay, I've rushed through a lot of things there, and so probably it's time for questions now. But I will just mention one last thing, which is that I've got a preprint about this particular issue of type 1 error rates and p-hacking. And like I say, for doubters amongst you, and I'm sure there are probably many, in that preprint, I do more clearly distinguish between the Mayo's error statistical approach and my own view, in order to tease apart those differences there and qualify a bit more that there are some good grounds, I would say, for believing that multiple testing can be problematic under some philosophies of significance testing. And I've got a few other things, but just to mention that I have a list of some critical meta-science articles on my website, and I have a Substack where I talk about these sorts of issues sort of fairly regularly as well. That's it from me. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you again for your time.